Martha Calloway had not slept well in 3 years. It was not the kind of sleeplessness that came from worry alone, though worry was certainly part of it. It was the kind that comes from a house that used to hold more sound, a deeper voice, heavier footsteps, the particular way a man clears his throat before he says something he thinks is funny. Her husband, Gene, had been gone for 38 months. She had counted every single one of them. She lived on the edge of Haskell County, Texas, in a small rental house with a rusting screen door that slapped shut behind her every morning when she left for work. The house had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window above the sink that faced east, and a porch where she liked to sit with her coffee before the sun got too serious about the day. The rent was $460 a month. She had never missed a payment, but some months it had come close. Martha was 54 years old. She had brown hair that had gone partly gray at the temples, and she wore it pulled back in a clip when she was working. Her hands were strong from years of carrying plates and lifting trays, and there were fine lines at the corners of her eyes that deepened when she smiled, which was often, because she had decided a long time ago that smiling was something you had to choose to keep doing, even when it did not come naturally. She worked at Denny's Diner on Route 12, the one with the faded yellow awning and the neon coffee cup sign that buzzed a little in the evenings. She had worked there for 11 years, first part-time when her children were in school, then full-time after Gene passed. She knew every booth by number, every regular by name and usual order, and she had learned which customers needed the coffee refilled before they asked, and which ones just needed someone to leave them alone with their eggs. Her son Daniel was 27 and lived with her. He had a quiet, thoughtful way about him that reminded her of Gene, though she never said so out loud, because she did not want him to feel the weight of that comparison. Daniel had started 2 community college programs and left both of them, not from laziness, but from a kind of restlessness that neither of them quite had words for yet. He worked at a lumber warehouse 40 minutes away, loading and stacking, and came home in the evenings smelling like sawdust, with a look on his face that told Martha he was somewhere else in his head, even when he was sitting right in front of her. Her daughter Becca was 24 and taught art at a middle school in a town 40 minutes in the other direction. Becca had her father's energy, quick and bright and a little impatient, and she called Martha every evening on her drive home, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. She had been living in a studio apartment for 2 years and was trying very hard to be independent, which Martha respected deeply and missed terribly at the same time. The 3 of them were not poor in the way that makes headlines. They were poor in the way that is quiet and invisible, the way where the refrigerator always has something in it but the choices are limited, where you never take vacations but you always find a reason to say it did not matter, where the car needs new tires, but the tires can wait 1 more month and then 1 more after that. It was a life built on small negotiations between what you needed and what you could manage, and Martha had become very skilled at those negotiations, without ever quite admitting that was what she was doing. On the morning that everything began to change, she had just finished a double shift. It was a Thursday in August, the kind of August that Texas does without apology. The air so thick and hot that breathing felt like a small effort, the road shimmering at the edges in a way that made everything look slightly unreal. She had been on her feet since 6 in the morning. Her lower back ached in the way it always did after a long day, a deep, dull pressure that she had learned to ignore the way you learn to ignore a song you have heard too many times. She was driving her 2009 Chevy Malibu, which had a crack in the windshield on the passenger side that she had been meaning to get fixed for 7 months. The radio was on low, playing something country that she half listened to. The windows were down because the air conditioning made a noise she did not trust. She was thinking about nothing in particular, about whether there was enough milk at home, about a table of 8 that had left her a generous tip that afternoon, about the way the light looked in the west, orange and deep and beautiful, in the way that only August sunsets in Texas can be. She almost did not see it. The old pickup truck was pulled halfway off the road into the shallow ditch that ran along the shoulder of Route 12. It was a faded green Ford, older than her car by at least a decade, and at first she thought it had simply broken down. People's cars broke down on this road sometimes. She had seen it before. She slowed without fully deciding to slow, the way the body sometimes acts before the mind catches up. Then she saw his head. The man inside was slumped against the steering wheel, his forehead resting on his hands where they had fallen forward. He was not moving. The driver's side door was slightly open, as though he had tried to get out and not made it. Martha pulled over, she would not have been able to explain exactly why she did it with such certainty. There was no real hesitation, no moment where she weighed the risks or thought about what might happen next. She simply pulled over and got out of her car, the way you do when something in you recognizes that this is not a moment for deliberation. She crossed the short distance to the truck in a few steps. The man inside was elderly, she could see that immediately, with white hair and deeply tanned skin, and large, weathered hands that had slipped down from the wheel and rested on his thighs. He was breathing. She could see his chest moving. Shallow, but moving. She said, "Excuse me." She said hello. She put her hand on his arm and felt how hot it was, though whether that was from the sun pouring through the windshield or something else, she could not tell. He stirred slightly, his eyes opening a little, pale blue, unfocused, like someone waking from a dream they did not entirely want to leave. He said something she did not catch. She leaned closer. "I'm all right," he said, very slowly, in the tone of a man who was not sure whether he was telling her or himself. "Sir," Martha said, keeping her voice calm, "I don't think you are. I'm going to call for help right now. I need you to stay with me." Her phone had a cracked screen, and sometimes the touch did not work right in certain spots, and she had a moment of pure panic trying to get the numbers to respond, but it went through. The dispatcher's voice came on, and Martha told her where they were as precisely as she could. The mile marker, the direction, the approximate distance from the intersection of 12 and County Road 7. She had driven this road 1,000 times and she knew it. The dispatcher told her an ambulance would be 30 to 35 minutes out. Martha said she understood. She stayed on with the dispatcher for a moment longer, answering questions about the man's condition, his breathing, whether he was conscious, whether he was responding. She answered every question steadily, one at a time. Then she hung up and stayed with him. She found a water bottle in the back seat of her own car, half full and warm from the heat, and brought it back to him. She wet the hem of her apron. She was still in her work clothes, the pale blue uniform with the little name tag that said Martha in rounded letters, and she pressed the damp fabric gently against the man's forehead and the back of his neck. He closed his eyes. "What's your name?" she asked him. A pause. Then, slowly, "Elias." "Elias," she said. "I'm Martha. I need you to keep talking to me, okay? Tell me something. Tell me anything you want." "Hot," he said. "It is hot," she agreed. "It's very hot. You're right about that. What were you doing out here today, Elias?" Another long pause. His eyes drifted open, and then almost shut again. "Feed store," he said. "Was going to the feed store." "Were you driving yourself?" "Always drive myself," he said, with just a flicker of something. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness, which are sometimes the same thing in a man his age. "Well," Martha said, "you're going to have some help today, okay? Someone's coming. You just need to stay here with me for a little while." She kept talking to him. She talked about the weather, about the color of the evening sky, about the fact that she had just come off a double shift and was looking forward to sitting down. She talked about nothing important and everything necessary. She was not trained in any of this. She was a waitress from a small town in Texas with a cracked phone screen and a damp apron, and she sat beside that old man in the heat and talked to him for 28 minutes, until she heard the sound she had been listening for. The ambulance came from the south, its lights cutting through the golden haze of the late afternoon. Martha stepped back to give the paramedics room and stood at the edge of the road, her arms crossed, watching them work with the quiet efficiency that trained people have in moments like this. One of them glanced at her. "You find him?" "Yes," she said. "He was slumped over the wheel. He's been responsive, but he's not quite right. His name is Elias. I don't know his last name." The paramedic nodded and turned back to his work. Martha watched as they got Elias onto a stretcher, as they checked his vitals and spoke to each other in the shorthand of people who do this every day. Elias's eyes found her once from the stretcher. She raised her hand in a small wave. He did not wave back, but he held her gaze for a moment, and she thought that counted for something. They put him in the ambulance, and the doors closed, and it pulled back onto the road, and she stood there watching the lights until they disappeared around a curve. Then she stood there a moment longer, alone on the side of Route 12, with the evening coming down around her, and she felt something she could not immediately name. Not sadness, not exactly relief, something quieter than both of those. She got back into her car, checked her mirrors, and pulled carefully back onto the road. She thought about him the whole drive home. She told Daniel about it over dinner that night, leftover pasta from 2 days ago, which was fine. They were both practical about food. She told the story plainly, without drama, the way she told most things. Daniel listened with his fork halfway to his mouth, and then put it down. "Do you know which hospital they took him to?" he asked. "County General, probably," she said. "That's the nearest. Are you going to try to find out if he's okay?" She had already been thinking about this. "I think I will," she said. "I know it's probably not my business, but I'd like to know." Daniel said he thought that was the right thing. He was like that, straightforward in his support, uncomplicated about it. She appreciated that about him more than she had words for. That night, lying in bed with the small window fan running and the sound of the road in the distance, Martha thought about Elias's pale blue eyes and the way he had said he always drove himself. She thought about a man that age, that weathered, doing everything alone. She thought about Jean, the way she always thought about Jean in the quiet, not with sharp pain anymore, but with the kind of aching tenderness that stays even after the sharp parts have worn smooth. She thought, "I hope he has someone to go home to." She thought, "I hope someone is with him right now." She turned onto her side and eventually fell asleep, and in the morning, she got up and made coffee, and stood at her east-facing kitchen window, and watched the sun come up. And she decided that before her shift today, she was going to call County General and ask about an elderly man named Elias, who had been brought in the evening before from Route 12. She did not know yet what that decision would set in motion. She did not know what was waiting for her at the other end of it. She only knew that she could not do the opposite, could not simply not call, could not go about her day without knowing whether that old man was all right. That was simply who Martha Calloway was. She had been that way her whole life, long before the grief and the tight budgets and the double shifts. She had been that way as a girl, as a young wife, as a mother. She picked things up that other people walked past. She noticed the thing others did not. She stopped. And on that particular August evening on Route 12, that quality, that plain, ordinary, unremarkable quality, that she herself would never have called anything special, had changed the course of more than one life. She just did not know it yet. The morning light spread across her kitchen floor in the slow, familiar way it always did. She poured her coffee. She picked up her phone. She dialed. It rang twice. A woman answered. Martha said, "Good morning. I'm calling to ask about a patient who was brought in last evening. His first name is Elias. I believe he came in from Route 12. There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of someone checking something. Then, "Are you family?" Martha thought about this for exactly 1 second. "No," she said honestly, "but I was the one who found him. I just want to know if he's okay." Another pause. Then, more gently, "He's stable. He's resting comfortably. That's all I can tell you." "That's enough," Martha said. "Thank you." She hung up and stood at her kitchen window a moment longer. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its whole repertoire in the old oak tree at the edge of the yard. The sky was already turning from soft pink to the deep blue of a Texas morning getting serious. Stable, resting comfortably. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Then she finished her coffee, rinsed her cup, and went to get ready for work. The word stable did something to Martha that surprised her. She had expected to feel simply relieved, a clean, uncomplicated relief, the kind that lets you set something down and walk away from it. But what she actually felt was more complicated than that. The relief was there, but underneath it was something else, something she did not examine too carefully, because she had learned over the years that some feelings are better left to sort themselves out without too much prodding. She took her tables, refilled her coffees, remembered that the couple in booth 4 always wanted extra cream even though they never asked for it, and smiled at the old men who came in every morning at 7 and sat at the counter and talked about weather and cattle prices, and the kind of things men of a certain age and background talk about when they gather. She did her job. She was good at her job. But part of her mind, a small and quiet part, kept returning to an old man, with pale blue eyes, and large, weathered hands, and a voice that said, "I always drive myself the way a man says something he has been saying his whole life." By the end of her shift, she had made a decision, and the decision was this: she was going to go to the hospital. She was not entirely sure why. He was stable. He was resting. The hospital had told her so, and there was no reason to doubt it. She was not family. She was not even, technically speaking, an acquaintance. She was simply the woman who had pulled over on a hot evening on Route 12 and stayed beside him until the paramedics came. That was all. It would have been perfectly reasonable to consider that chapter closed. But she bought a small arrangement of yellow flowers from the gas station near the diner, the kind that come wrapped in cellophane and are not particularly impressive but are cheerful in the straightforward way that yellow flowers always are. And she drove to County General. She asked at the front desk. She gave his first name. The woman at the desk checked her screen and said, "Elias Drummond, room 214. Are you family?" "No," Martha said, for the second time in 2 days. "I'm the one who found him." The woman at the desk looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Go on up. I'll let the nurse know." Martha took the elevator to the second floor. She walked down a hallway that smelled the way hospital hallways always smell, antiseptic, and something underneath it. Something that is not quite identifiable, but that makes you walk a little more quietly than you otherwise would. She found room 214 and knocked lightly on the open door. The man inside was propped up against the pillows, awake. In the daylight, in the context of the hospital bed with its pale sheets and the IV line in his arm, he looked both more and less frail than he had in the truck. More, because the vulnerability of a hospital makes everyone look smaller. Less, because she could see now that he was a big man, broad through the shoulders even now, with the kind of frame that tells you what a person looked like decades ago, in the years when they were taking on the world. He looked at her. She held up the flowers. "These aren't much," she said, "but they were the best option at the gas station." He looked at the flowers, then he looked at her, and then, slowly, something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the territory just adjacent to one. The place where a smile lives before it decides whether to show itself. "You're the woman from the road," he said. His voice was stronger than it had been the evening before. Still slow, still careful, but with more substance to it. "I am," Martha said. "Martha Calloway. I hope you don't mind the visit. I wanted to see for myself that you were all right." "Come in," he said, and there was a note of something in those two words, something that was not quite surprise, but was close to it, like a man who had not expected company, and found, now that it was here, that he did not object to it. She came in and set the flowers on the small table beside his bed, and sat down in the chair that was placed beside it. The chair was the particular kind of chair that hospitals provide for visitors, meant to be functional and not particularly comfortable, which Martha thought might be intentional, to discourage people from staying too long. She intended to stay only a short while. She stayed an hour. She learned, in that hour, a great deal about Elias Drummond, and she learned it in the way that you learn things about people who have lived long lives and do not waste words. Not in a rush, not in a flood of information, but one thing at a time, each thing placed down carefully, like a stone in a path. His name was Elias Henry Drummond. He was 79 years old. He had been born on the land where he still lived, which was a ranch his great-grandfather had established in 1891. The ranch was called Drummond Ranch, which he acknowledged was not a particularly creative name, but which he said with the dry, sideways humor of a man who has long since stopped worrying about what things sound like and only cares about what they are. His wife had been named June. She had passed 6 years ago. He said her name the way people say the names of those they have loved for a very long time, as a complete sentence in itself, as if the name alone holds everything that needs to be said, and anything added to it would only diminish it. He had no children. He said this simply, without apology or elaboration, in the tone of a man who has had decades to make peace with a fact, and has done so. He had distant relatives, he said, cousins and their children, most of them in other states, but they were not close. And he did not say this with bitterness, just with the plain matter-of-factness of someone reporting the weather. He ran the ranch himself, with the help of 2 men who had worked for him for many years. He did his own driving, his own shopping, his own cooking. He had done all of this since June passed, and he intended to go on doing it. "What happened yesterday?" Martha asked. "If you don't mind my asking." He did not mind. He told her that it had been a very hot day. She already knew this, and that he had not eaten enough and had not drunk enough water, which he acknowledged was a foolish thing for a man his age who knew better, but that sometimes you get busy and you forget. He had felt the heat catching up with him, about a mile before he pulled over, and he had had the sense to get off the road before he lost the ability to make that decision. He said he thought the worst of it was passing by the time she had knocked on the window, but that he was not certain about that, and that he was not inclined to pretend otherwise. "The doctor says it was heat exhaustion," he said. "Not the worst it could have been." "It could have been quite bad," Martha said. "Yes," he said. "It could have." He looked at her directly when he said this, and there was something in that look. Acknowledgement, maybe. The direct kind that old men who have been proud their whole lives have to work to allow themselves. She did not make a fuss about it. She did not say "you're welcome" or anything like that, because it was obvious he would not have wanted her to, and because she had not stopped because she wanted gratitude. She had stopped because she had seen a man slumped over a steering wheel and could not have done anything else. She left at around 6 in the evening, when the light outside the window was going gold, and a nurse came in to check his vitals. She shook his hand at the door, a firm, no-nonsense handshake, which seemed right for both of them, and told him she hoped he would be out soon and would take better care of himself in the heat. He said he reckoned he would try. She drove home and told Daniel about the visit over the sound of the television, which he turned down without being asked the moment he saw she had something to say. She told him about Elias, about the ranch, about June, about the no children, and the distant relatives, and the 2 men who helped him, and the way he had said, "I always drive myself." Daniel listened. When she finished, he said, "Sounds like he's pretty much on his own." "He is," Martha said. "That's a hard thing," Daniel said. "It is," she agreed. She called Becca that night and told her the same story. Becca, being Becca, had a great many questions. What was the ranch like? How much land? What kind of cattle? Was he nice? Did he have anyone at all? And Martha answered them as best she could, which was imperfectly, because she had not yet asked all of those questions herself. But she told Becca what she knew, and she told her that she had liked him. Not in a complicated way. Just in the plain way that you like a person when they are honest, and a little stubborn, and carry their life without making a spectacle of it. "Are you going to visit again?" Becca asked. Martha had been expecting this question, because it was the same one she had been turning over since she left the parking lot of County General. "I might," she said, "if he'd want that." "I think he would," Becca said. Martha was not sure how her daughter could know that, but she did not argue with it, because she thought Becca might be right. She went back the next day. She brought him a container of soup she had made at home, a simple vegetable soup, nothing complicated, because she was not sure what he could eat, and because simple things made well are often what a person needs when they are not well themselves. She set it on the table beside the yellow flowers, which were still holding up reasonably well. Elias looked at the soup. "You made that," he said. "This morning," she said. "It's just vegetables and broth, nothing fancy." He looked at it a moment longer. Then he said, "I haven't had homemade soup since June passed." Martha did not say anything to that. She simply sat down in the visitor's chair and let the statement stand as the large thing it was. They talked again. Differently this time. Less like an introduction, more like a continuation. He told her about the ranch in more detail, the cattle, the pastures, the particular way the land lay, and how it changed with the seasons. She could hear the love in it even when the words were practical, the way he described the north pasture in spring, the way the creek ran after a good rain, the sound of the cattle in the early morning. It was the way people talk about places they have known their whole lives, places that are woven into who they are, so completely, that describing the place is the same as describing themselves. She told him about the diner, about the regulars, about the way the morning shift had a different feeling than the afternoon shift, which had a different feeling from the evening. She told him about Daniel and the warehouse, and the restlessness, and about Becca, and the middle school, and the evening phone calls. She told him about Jean, not everything, not the whole grief of it, but enough. She said his name clearly, the way Elias had said June, letting it be a complete thing. Elias said, "How long?" 38 months, she said. Almost 40 now. 6 years for me, he said. It doesn't get smaller. It just gets different. Yes, Martha said. That's exactly the right word. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have both lost someone and recognize it in each other. It is a specific kind of quiet. It is not sad. Exactly. It is just full. She left in the early evening again, this time making sure she did not stay past when he needed to rest. At the door, Elias said, "Martha." She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for the soup, and for the other thing." "You're welcome," she said. And then, because it seemed true, "I enjoyed talking with you." He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him turning something over behind those pale blue eyes. Then he said, "Come back, if you want to." She said she would. She meant it. And on the drive home, with the evening spreading itself across the wide Texas sky, in colors she had seen 1,000 times, and never quite gotten tired of, Martha Calloway felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Life was too complicated for that simple a word. But something adjacent to it. A warmth, a sense of something opening, rather than closing. She did not name it. She just let it ride home, with her in the passenger seat, quiet and uncomplicated, like good company on a long drive. Elias Drummond had been in the hospital for 4 days when they told him he was ready to go home. He received this news with the same unhurried calm he seemed to bring to everything, a nod, a few practical questions about what he should and should not do in the week ahead, and then a request for his clothes and his hat, which a nurse located in the small cupboard beside the bed. Martha was there when he was discharged. She had not planned to be. She had come for what she thought would be a short visit, only to arrive at the same time as the doctor who was delivering the discharge paperwork, and it had seemed awkward to leave in the middle of all that, and so she had stayed. And when the process was complete, and Elias was sitting on the edge of the bed in his boots and jeans and a western shirt that was slightly too large for him now, she noticed that, how the collar hung, it was Martha who asked the practical question. "Is someone coming to pick you up?" Elias looked at her. Then he looked at the room, as though the answer to her question might be somewhere in it. Then he said, "I was going to call a cab." Martha said, "I'll drive you." He did not argue. She had already noticed that he did not argue with reasonable things when they were offered by people he trusted, and she had somehow, without entirely meaning to, become a person he trusted. She was not sure exactly when that had happened. She thought it might have been during the second visit, or possibly during the first, or perhaps even on the road beside his truck when he had looked up at her with those unfocused blue eyes, and she had told him to stay with her, and he had. She drove him home. The ranch was about 22 miles east of town, reached by turning off Route 12 onto a county road, and then onto a gravel lane that ran between 2 long pastures and ended at a gate. The gate had a metal sign mounted on it that said Drummond, in letters that had once been painted but had mostly weathered off. Elias reached out the window as they drove up and worked the latch with the practiced ease of a man who has opened that gate 10,000 times. Martha drove through. The gravel lane continued for another quarter-mile to the house. She had not known what to expect. She found that she had been imagining a certain kind of place, modest, functional, a working man's house, and the reality matched that expectation in most ways, but exceeded it in others. The house was a large, single-story structure, white painted, though the paint was graying, with a covered porch that ran along the full front of it. It sat on a slight rise, and behind it the land spread away in every direction, pasture and sky, and the low shapes of distant trees, along what she thought must be the creek he had described. She could see, even from the driveway, why a person would love this place. She helped him inside. He did not need much help. He was steadier on his feet now than he had been, but she carried the small bag the hospital had sent home with him and held the screen door while he worked the front door lock. And once inside, she stood in the entryway of a house that told a whole story without anyone saying a word. It was a lived-in house, not neglected, but clearly the house of someone who used every room practically and had stopped worrying about whether things looked a certain way. There were books on a wooden table near the window, a pair of work gloves on the kitchen counter, photographs on the walls, many photographs, spanning what looked like the entire history of the property and the family that had worked it. Children and horses and cattle drives and harvests and decades of Texas weather, captured in black and white and then in color as the years progressed. A woman appeared in many of them, young at first, then middle-aged, then older, always with the same quality in her face. Alert, warm, slightly amused, the face of someone who is paying attention and finding what she sees mostly good. Martha stood in front of one of the photographs for a moment. a woman standing in a field, laughing at something off camera. Her hair was dark and loose around her shoulders. June, Elias said, from behind her. She's lovely, Martha said. She was, he said, and walked past into the kitchen. And Martha understood that some statements do not invite further conversation, and knew enough to let this one stand alone. She made him tea, because he said he did not drink coffee after noon, a detail she filed away without thinking about it, and she checked the refrigerator while the kettle was on, noting what was and was not there. He had eggs, butter, some cheese, an onion, and a carton of milk that was 2 days from its date. There was a half loaf of bread. There were things in the freezer she did not investigate. I'll make you something to eat before I go, she said. Is eggs okay? You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said, and took out the eggs. He sat at the kitchen table while she cooked, and they talked the way they had learned to talk, not filling every silence, but not letting things go too quiet either. He told her about the 2 men who worked the ranch, both named in passing, the way you name people you have worked beside for years, and whose names have become so ordinary to you that the formality of introduction feels strange. Their names were Pete and Calvin. Pete was 63 and had been with Elias for 22 years. Calvin was 48 and had come on about 12 years ago. They lived in the small house on the south side of the property that had been the original family homestead before the larger house was built in 1947. They'll be in tomorrow, Elias said. They know I'm coming home. Good, Martha said, sliding the eggs onto a plate and setting it in front of him. Then you won't be alone. He looked at the plate, then at her. He said, You cook like someone who's been feeding people their whole life. She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, unguarded, the kind that comes out before you've decided to let it. That's more or less exactly what I've been doing, she said. She left him at his kitchen table with his eggs and his tea and a phone number, her own, written on the back of a receipt from her purse, which was the only paper she had handy. She told him to call if he needed anything. He said he reckoned he would be fine. She said she knew that, and to call anyway. He almost smiled at that. She drove home and did not think too much about what had just happened, because she was a practical woman, and thinking too much about things was not, in her experience, particularly useful. She had met a man, she had helped him, she had visited him and driven him home, and made him eggs, and now she was going home, and tomorrow she had the morning shift, and that was the shape of the next day. And yet, she mentioned Elias to Daniel that evening, just in passing, and Daniel listened with the same quiet attention he always gave her and then asked, Is he doing okay out there alone? He has help, she said. 2 men who work the ranch. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he said, But in the house? Martha looked at her son. He was smart, Daniel was. He just sometimes pointed his intelligence at the wrong things, and when he pointed it at the right thing it was very clear. In the house, she said. He's alone. Daniel nodded again and did not say anything more, which was a way of saying everything that needed to be said. She called Elias 2 days later. She told herself it was just to check in, just to make sure the discharge instructions had not given him any trouble. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding better, more solid, more himself, less like a man who had been in a hospital, and more like a man who lived on a ranch and had opinions about the day. She asked how he was. He said he was well. She asked about Pete and Calvin. He said they had come in the morning after he was home, and had done the work without needing to be told what, which was what happened when you had the right people. Then there was a short pause, and he said, How are you, Martha? It was such a simple question. People asked it all the time, dozens of times a day, and most of the time it was just a courtesy, a social hinge, something to say before the real conversation. But when Elias asked it, he said it the way he seemed to do most things, slowly, with weight, as if he actually wanted to know. She told him she was fine. She told him the morning shift had been busy, and the tips had been decent, and she had taken Daniel's truck to get his tires looked at. She told him small, real things, the kind that are usually too small to tell people, and he listened to all of them without hurrying her. When she finished, he said, Well, that sounds like a full day. It usually is, she said. Mine too, he said, glad to be back in it. She said she was glad too. She meant it. After she hung up, she sat for a moment in the chair by the window, the evening light coming in warm and low across the floor, and she thought about the photographs on his walls, and the empty rooms of that large, quiet house, and the way he had looked at June's picture. Steady, no flinching, the way you look at something that is both precious and painful, and you have decided you are not going to look away from. She thought about Jean. She thought about how strange life was, how a hot August evening and a cracked phone screen and a gas station's worth of yellow flowers could lead you to a kitchen table 22 miles east of town, frying eggs for a man you had not known a week ago. She thought about the land spreading away behind the house in every direction, vast and quiet, and not belonging to anyone for as far as the eye could see, or so it seemed. She thought about what Daniel had said. In the house, he's alone. She looked out the window at the darkening street, the familiar shapes of the neighborhood she had lived in for 12 years, the oak tree, and the street light, and the neighbor's mailbox that had been slightly tilted since a truck hit it in the spring. She said, very quietly, to no one, "So is he." And then she got up and went to put the kettle on, because that was what she did when she needed to think, and there were things she was beginning to think about that were going to take some time. The visits continued, and Martha would not have been able to say, afterward, exactly when they shifted from something she was doing out of concern into something she was doing because she wanted to. That shift was gradual, the way most real things are. Not a moment, but a slow accumulation of moments, each one small enough on its own that you might not notice it, but together forming something you could look back at and recognize. She went twice in the first week after his discharge. Then, once the following week. Then, without discussing it or making it official, they had settled into a pattern that felt natural to both of them. She would come out on Sunday afternoons, and sometimes on a Wednesday if her shift ended early, and she did not have anything that needed doing at home. She brought food sometimes, because she liked cooking and he liked eating what she brought, and also because it was practical. He was a man who cooked for himself the way men of his generation often do, which is to say, adequately and without much imagination, the kind of cooking that keeps a person going, without giving them anything to look forward to. She brought things that held up well in the heat, a pot of chili, a pan of cornbread, a chicken stew that Daniel declared was the best she had made in years, which she took as a compliment, and also as a cue to make another batch so Daniel could have some too. She was careful not to make a project of feeding Elias, because she sensed that would bother him, and so she framed it always as an excess of cooking, rather than a targeted effort, which was mostly true. In those visits, she learned more of him. Not quickly, not in large amounts, but steadily. He was a man who gave information the way some people give out money, not stingily, but thoughtfully, only when it felt right, only when it had been asked for, or naturally arrived at. She learned that he had been born in the front bedroom of the house in 1944, delivered by a doctor who had driven 40 miles on unpaved road to get there. She learned that he had gone to school in town until 8th grade, after which his father had needed him on the ranch, and that had been the end of formal education. She learned that he had taught himself to read widely from the library in town, returning books in stacks and coming home with new ones, a habit he had never broken even now. The books on the table by the window were not decoration. They were worn through with reading. She learned that he had met June, when they were both 19, at a church social she almost had not attended because her shoes were giving her trouble, and that he had talked to her for 3 hours that evening about nothing much and come home knowing he was going to marry her. He said this without any sense that it was remarkable, the way people describe things that were simply the shape of their life, and the shape of things could not have been different. Martha listened to these things carefully, not collecting them but receiving them. There is a difference. Collecting is what you do when you want to have something. Receiving is what you do when you want to understand someone. Elias, for his part, listened to her in the same way. He asked about Jean, not probing questions, not the invasive kind that some people ask when they want the drama of your grief to confirm something about their own view of life, but real questions, the kind that showed he had been paying attention to the small things she had already shared, and wanted to know more of the same quality. She told him about how they had met, through a friend, at a 4th of July gathering, Jean arriving late with a broken bicycle chain, and a cheerful refusal to be bothered by it. She told him about the early years, the scraping by, the way they had built what they had piece by piece. She told him about Jean's laugh, which was loud and completely unself-conscious, and which could be heard from the next room, and sometimes from the driveway. Elias said, "Sounds like a man who took up the right amount of space." Martha felt something sharp move through her chest at that, not pain exactly, but the particular ache of recognition, of a thing being described more precisely than you yourself had ever managed. "That's exactly right," she said. "That's exactly what he did." She talked about Daniel and Becca more, and Elias listened to those conversations with interest. He asked about Daniel's warehouse job, about whether the work suited him. Martha said she did not think it did, not entirely. Elias asked what Daniel was good at, what he was drawn to. Martha thought about this. She said he was good with his hands, good at figuring out how things worked, good at seeing when something needed doing and doing it without needing to be asked. He liked to be outside. He liked to be useful in a physical way. Elias said, "Sounds like someone who ought to be doing something with land." Martha had not thought of it in exactly those terms before, but when he said it, something clicked. "He might be," she said slowly. "Not uncommon," Elias said. "Some people figure out early what they're meant for. Others take a while to find the right thing. The finding matters more than the timing." He said things like this occasionally, not wisdom for the sake of hearing himself be wise, but practical observations from a long life. Offered the way he offered everything, plainly, without decoration. Martha thought about that one for days. She brought Daniel out one Sunday in late September. She had not planned to, or she had, but had not said so out loud, had simply suggested that Daniel might want to take a drive, that she was going to visit her friend Elias out on the ranch, which was the first time she had used the word friend, and she noticed it as she said it, and did not take it back. Daniel, who was rarely surprised by anything his mother did, but was occasionally impressed by it, agreed readily enough. The drive out was quiet, in the comfortable way that drives with Daniel often were. He looked at the landscape as it opened up east of town, the wide, flat sweep of it, the scrub and grass, the sky going enormous above it, the way it does when you leave the small geography of houses and streets behind. At the gate, Daniel got out of the car without being asked, and worked the latch. Martha pulled through, and waited for him to close it behind them, and get back in. "Big gate," he said. "Big ranch," she said. She introduced them at the front porch, Elias coming out when he heard the car, moving with the careful steadiness of a man who was fully recovered, but had learned something from the summer about taking his time. He shook Daniel's hand, a proper handshake, firm and direct, the kind that tells you something about a person, and looked at him, with the measuring quality that Martha had come to recognize, the way he looked at most things, attentively, without hurry, taking the full measure. Daniel, to his credit, looked right back. They spent the afternoon at the ranch. Elias took Daniel out to see the operation, the cattle in the east pasture, the equipment shed, the old windmill that still worked, and the newer pump that had been put in 15 years ago, the creek that ran along the northern border of the property, with its line of cottonwoods turning yellow gold in the early fall. Martha watched from the porch for a while, and then went inside, and made coffee, and came back out and watched some more. What she saw was this. Daniel walked differently on that land than he did anywhere else she had observed him recently. He walked like a person who was paying attention, in a way that cost him nothing, naturally, easily, the attention flowing out of him, rather than being something he had to make an effort to sustain. He stopped at the fence when Elias pointed out something about the cattle. He crouched down at the creek and looked at the water the way someone looks at something they are genuinely curious about. He asked questions, good ones, practical ones, the kind that showed he was building an understanding rather than just filling silence. Elias, she noticed, answered each of them fully, which was not something he did with questions that did not deserve it. On the drive home, Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's an incredible piece of land." "It is," Martha agreed. Another silence. Then, "He takes good care of it." "He's been taking care of it his whole life," Martha said. Daniel looked out the window at the evening coming down over the landscape. He said, almost to himself, "That's what it would feel like, I think, to have something worth taking care of." Martha did not say anything to that. She kept her eyes on the road, and her hands on the wheel, and let her son have that thought to himself, the way you let something unfold when you sense that pressing it would only reduce it. But she kept it. She held it alongside the other things she had been holding lately, in the way that you accumulate evidence without yet knowing what it is evidence of. The weeks continued. The October air came in dry and cooler, and the ranch took on the particular quality that land gets in autumn. A sharpening, a clarity, the colors all turning specific and clean after the haziness of summer. Martha went on Sundays. She went on a Wednesday. She brought a pot of soup, and Elias said it was the best he had eaten in recent memory, and she believed him, because he was not a man who gave compliments carelessly. She learned that he was worried about the ranch, in a way that was different from practical worry. It was a deeper thing, a question about the future that did not have an obvious answer. He did not say this directly at first. He came at it sideways, the way people approach the things they are most concerned about, testing the ground before committing their full weight to it. One evening he said, "I've been thinking about what happens to this land after me." Martha looked at him. She waited. "There's no one in the family who knows it," he said. "The cousins, they grew up in cities. They wouldn't know what to do with it. They'd sell it, not out of malice, just because it would be the sensible thing for them, and the land would get broken up." He said this the way someone describes a thing they have already partially accepted but cannot yet fully accept. The voice even, the face steady, but something behind the eyes working hard. "What would happen to Pete and Calvin?" Martha asked. "They'd have to find other work," he said. "They'd manage. They're capable men. But this has been their home for a long time." Martha nodded. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. About the land and the men and the house and the photographs on the walls and the creek with the cottonwoods and the particular way a person's whole life can be held in a piece of ground. She said, "Have you talked to anyone about it?" "A lawyer?" "I have a lawyer," Elias said. "Howard Briggs. He's in town. Known him 20 years. He's been after me to update things for a while." "Maybe it's time to do that," Martha said, gently. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked out the window at the yard, where the evening was settling into the grass, and the cottonwood at the fence line was standing still against a pale sky. He said, "Maybe it is." She did not know, in that moment, what he was deciding. She thought she was offering practical encouragement about estate planning, the sensible kind that people who care about someone offer when they can see that something has been left undone too long. She did not understand, not yet, what ground she was actually standing on. But Elias knew. He had known for a few weeks by then, if she had understood him the way she thought she did. He was a man who moved slowly, and meant what he did, and he had already been turning something over in his mind, the way he turned everything, carefully, thoroughly, from all sides, until he was sure. She said goodbye on the porch that evening, and he raised a hand in his usual brief, undemonstrative way, and she drove home through the early dark, with the windows cracked and the radio on low, thinking about nothing in particular, and everything that mattered. Behind her, in the house on the rise, a lamp came on in the front window, and stayed on late into the night. Howard Briggs had practiced law in Haskell County for 31 years. He had a small office above the hardware store on Main Street, accessible by a staircase, that announced the arrival of every visitor with considerable enthusiasm, and he had spent 3 decades being the kind of lawyer that small towns need. Careful, thorough, discreet, and without any particular interest in drama. He drafted wills and handled property transfers, and occasionally sorted out disputes between neighbors over fence lines or water rights, and he did these things with the steady competence of someone who understood that most of the important legal work in the world is not glamorous. He had known Elias Drummond for 20 years, as Elias had said. He had drafted the current version of Elias's will 12 years ago, after June passed. He had been suggesting, gently and with increasing patience, that it was time to revisit it. Elias had acknowledged these suggestions, with the particular acknowledgement that means not yet, and Howard had respected it, because he understood men like Elias, men who run their own lives on their own timeline, who cannot be pushed, and will arrive at necessary things when they arrive, and not before. So when his phone rang on a Monday morning in late October, and it was Elias Drummond saying he was ready to talk about updating the estate documents, Howard was not entirely surprised. He was, however, curious. He went out to the ranch that Wednesday, which was how they had always done it. Howard drove out, because Elias did not come to people. People came to Elias, and Howard had long since accepted this as part of the working relationship. He brought his briefcase and his yellow legal pad and his coffee in a thermos, because the drive was 45 minutes, and he was a man who needed coffee. Elias met him at the door, and they sat at the kitchen table, which was where Elias did everything that mattered, and Howard noticed, as he always did, the quietness of the house. The particular quietness of a large house with one person in it. He had known June. Her absence was palpable in the way that the absence of a person who had truly occupied a space always is. They talked for 2 hours. Howard listened more than he spoke, which was his practice, and what he heard was a man who had done his thinking, and was not uncertain about it. Elias laid out what he wanted with the same methodical clarity he brought to managing the ranch. Not hurried, not vague. Every piece placed deliberately. Howard wrote on his legal pad and asked clarifying questions when he needed to, and did not offer opinions unless asked. At the end of the meeting, Howard closed his yellow legal pad and looked at Elias across the table. He said, "I want to make sure I understand this correctly, because I want to make sure you've thought through all of it." Elias looked at him steadily. "You want to restructure the estate to designate a woman you've known for approximately 2 months as the primary beneficiary," Howard said. "A woman with no legal connection to you, no history with the property, and who is not aware of any of this." "That's right," Elias said. Howard nodded slowly. He said, "I'm not telling you not to do it. That's your business, not mine. But I am going to ask you to tell me why, because part of my job is to make sure you're clear on what you want and why you want it, and that this isn't going to be something that gets challenged successfully later." Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window. Then he looked at Howard. He said, "I've been running this ranch my whole life. I have loved this land as much as a man can love a piece of ground. I have worked it and maintained it, and added to what my father and grandfather and great-grandfather built, and I intend to go on doing that for as long as I can. But I'm not a foolish man, Howard. I know what I'm walking toward." Howard said nothing. He waited. "June and I wanted children," Elias said. "It didn't happen. That's a fact I made my peace with a long time ago. But the consequence of that fact is that there is no one who knows this land, no one who belongs to it, no one who would treat it the way it ought to be treated when I'm gone. The cousins are good people, probably, but they would sell it. They wouldn't mean any harm by it. It would just be what made sense to them." He paused. Howard still did not speak. "I've spent 6 weeks watching a woman," Elias said. "A woman who stopped on a hot road when she did not have to stop, who came to the hospital with gas station flowers and homemade soup, and sat with me, and talked to me like I was a person worth talking to, who has been coming out here every week since I came home, and has never once asked me for anything, not one single thing, who brought her son out here one afternoon, and I watched that boy walk this land the way a person walks something they recognize." He stopped. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. "I know what I'm doing, Howard," he said. "I've known what I was doing since about the 3rd week. I've been taking my time because I wanted to be sure. I'm sure." Howard looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his legal pad again. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything." It took another hour to get through the details. Elias had thought about all of it. The ranch, the livestock, the equipment, the house and everything in it. The operating accounts. He wanted a trust established that would cover the ranch's operating costs for 5 years, because he understood that inheriting land was one thing, and having the means to run it was another, and he did not want to give someone a gift that became a burden. He wanted Pete and Calvin to have a guarantee of continued employment for at least 3 years, because they had given their working lives to the ranch, and deserved the security of knowing it would not simply disappear from under them. This he said without sentiment, as a practical obligation, which Howard thought was perhaps even more meaningful for that. He wanted the house, and the furnishings and the photographs, to remain with the property, not to be sold off or dispersed, because the house was the history of the place, and the history of the place should stay where the place was. Howard wrote all of this down. He asked his questions, the careful, specific questions of a man whose job it is to make things survive legal scrutiny, and Elias answered each one. Then Howard asked, "What if she doesn't accept it?" Elias looked at him. "She'll think about not accepting it," he said. "That's the kind of person she is. She'll think it's too much, that it isn't right. She'll probably say no before she says yes." "But she'll say yes?" Howard said. "I think she will," Elias said. "But if she doesn't, the land goes to Pete and Calvin to manage in trust, with the County Land Conservation Board holding the deed, on condition that it never be subdivided or developed. The cattle operation continues. The land stays intact." Howard said, That's a complex arrangement. I have a complex situation, Elias said. Howard said, fair enough. He drove back to town, with his yellow legal pad full, and his thermos empty, and his mind working through the structure of what Elias had asked him to build. It was unusual, not unprecedented. Howard had seen stranger things in 31 years, but unusual. He had seen rich people leave money to people they barely knew. He had seen people disinherit families. He had seen all of it. What he had not often seen was a man this clear-eyed about exactly what he was doing, and exactly why. He started drafting that evening. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Martha Calloway finished her afternoon shift, changed out of her uniform in the small staff bathroom at the back of the diner, and drove home in the October dusk. She was thinking about the leftover chicken she was going to warm up for dinner, and about whether Daniel had remembered to pay the electric bill, which he said he would do, and which she was not entirely confident he had done. She was not thinking about Elias's estate. She was not thinking about the photographs on his walls, or the acres spreading away behind his house, or the operating trust, or the 5-year financial cushion. She was not thinking about any of this, because she had no idea any of it existed. She was thinking about whether there were enough potatoes to make something on the side with the chicken. She got home. Daniel was on the couch, watching something on the laptop with headphones around his neck in the way he wore them, when he might want to listen but was not currently listening. He looked up when she came in. She asked about the electric bill. He said he had paid it 2 days ago. She said good. He asked if there was something for dinner. She said she was warming up the chicken. He said that was fine, and went back to the laptop. She put the chicken in the oven and sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes before going to shower and change. The kitchen was quiet in the way it was quiet most evenings. Just the small sounds of the house, the oven ticking, the refrigerator humming, the sound of someone's television distantly through the shared wall. She thought, as she sometimes did these days, about the ranch. She thought about the north pasture and the way Elias had described it in spring. She thought about the creek and the cottonwoods, which she had seen in early fall, and which had been gold and rustling and lovely, in a way that made you stop and look. She thought about the kitchen where she had cooked so many things on so many Sundays, the window above the sink that faced south, the photographs in the hallway that told 4 generations of a family's story. She thought about Elias saying, "I've been thinking about what happens to this land after me." She thought about Daniel walking the fence line, stopping to crouch at the creek, the way his face had looked open, in a way it did not always look. She thought, what a life it must be, to love a place that completely, to have something that big and that real to belong to. She was not jealous of it. She was not coveting anything. She was only thinking, in the way that she sometimes sat at this kitchen table in the evenings and let her mind go to the things that moved her, the things she found beautiful or important, the things that made her feel like life was more than its arrangements. The oven clicked. She got up. She put plates on the counter. She did not know, as she stood in her kitchen in the October evening, that 22 miles to the east, a man was on the phone with his lawyer, talking about how to make sure that she and her children would have a future as rooted and real and lasting as anything he had spent his life building. She did not know. She just made dinner. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Martha almost did not notice it at first. She came home from the early shift at 2:15, tired in the way that mornings at the diner make you tired. Not exhausted, just hollowed out a little, like a jar that has had something poured out of it and is waiting to be filled again. She brought in the mail from the box by the front steps and went through it at the counter in the way she always did, sorting. Bill, circular, something addressed to Daniel she set aside, and then an envelope that was different from the others. It was large and white and stiff, the kind of envelope that holds papers that have been carefully folded. It was addressed to her in full, Martha Lynn Calloway, with the return address of an office she did not immediately recognize, Briggs Legal Services, with a street address in town. She set the rest of the mail down. She knew Howard Briggs's name. Elias had mentioned him, his lawyer. She stood at the counter and held the envelope, and the first thing she felt was a small, calm alarm. The kind that comes not from fear exactly, but from the sense that something important is about to happen, and you are not entirely ready for it. She opened the envelope carefully, the way she opened all envelopes, sliding her finger along the seal rather than tearing it. Inside were several pages of formal legal documents and a single handwritten note on plain paper. She read the note first. The handwriting was slow and large, the handwriting of a man whose hands were strong but who did not do a great deal of writing. It said, "Martha, I asked Howard to send this. Read the documents before you call me or anyone else. I want you to have the whole picture in front of you. I will explain anything that needs explaining. Elias." She set the note on the counter and picked up the first page of the documents. She read slowly. She read all of it. She went back and read parts of it a second time. The language was formal and precise in the way legal language is, but the meaning was clear enough, and it grew clearer with each page until she set the last page down on the counter and stood very still in her kitchen. The documents named her, Martha Lynn Calloway, as the primary beneficiary of the estate of Elias Henry Drummond. The estate included the property, 3,200 acres of Haskell County land, the livestock, the equipment, the house and its contents, and a trust that had been established to cover operating expenses for 5 years. There were provisions for Pete and Calvin, guaranteed employment and housing for a minimum of 3 years. There were conditions attached to the land. It could not be subdivided, could not be developed for commercial purposes, would remain a working cattle operation in perpetuity, or the estate would revert to a land conservation organization. She read her own name 4 times on those pages, Martha Lynn Calloway, as if to make sure it was still her name and not someone else's. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor. She did not plan to sit on the floor. Her legs simply decided that the floor was the appropriate place to be, and she let them. She sat with her back against the kitchen cabinets and the documents on the floor beside her, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about nothing for a little while. Just the ceiling. Just the ordinary, slightly water-stained ceiling of her kitchen that she had looked at for 12 years. Then she started crying. She was not entirely sure what she was crying about, which was unusual for her. She was a woman who understood her own feelings most of the time, perhaps not at the exact moment of feeling them, but shortly after, quickly enough that she could name them and deal with them practically. But this crying was different. It was not sadness. It was not fear, though there was something adjacent to fear in it. It was not gratitude, though that was somewhere in there too. It was something she did not have a name for, something that was made up of many things at once. Astonishment and weight and a kind of overwhelming tenderness, and something that felt, under all of it, like being seen in a way that was almost too large to absorb. She sat on the floor of her kitchen and cried for perhaps 5 minutes. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and picked up her phone and called Daniel. He did not answer. He was at work. Of course he was at work. She called Becca. Becca answered on the second ring. "Mom?" Becca's voice, quick and concerned at the sound of something in Martha's voice. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Martha took a breath. She said, "I need to tell you something. I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything." Becca said, "You're scaring me." "Don't be scared," Martha said. "It's not bad. I don't entirely know what it is yet. I need to say it out loud to someone and have them hear it with me." Becca said, "Okay, I'm listening." Martha told her. She read parts of the letter and parts of the documents because she needed Becca to be hearing the same words she was hearing, needed the confirmation that the words said what she thought they said. She read the part with her name. She read the part about the land. She read the part about the operating trust. When she finished, there was a silence on the phone that was not empty. It was full of the same things Martha had felt on the kitchen floor, all of them translated through another person, through Becca's quick, loving, overwhelmed self. Then Becca said, very quietly, "Mom." "I know," Martha said. "He's giving you the ranch." "He is." "The whole ranch, the land and the house and everything." "Yes." Another silence. Then, "Did you know? Did you have any idea?" "No," Martha said. "None." Becca was quiet again. Then she made a sound that was either a laugh or a sob, or possibly both. The kind of sound that people make when a feeling is too large for a single expression. She said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Martha said honestly. "I need to think. I need to talk to Elias." "Mom," Becca said, "you can't say no to this." "I might," Martha said. "You cannot," Becca said, with the particular firmness that her daughter was capable of. The kind that reminded Martha of Jean so much it sometimes made her breath catch. "Do you hear me? You cannot say no to this." Martha said, "I'll call you back." She sat at the table for a long time after she hung up. The documents were in front of her, neatly stacked because she had automatically straightened them when she got up from the floor. She read the note again, the slow, large handwriting. "Martha, I want you to have the whole picture in front of you." She thought about the whole picture. She tried to hold it all at once. The land and the house and the photographs and the creek and the cattle and Pete and Calvin and the operating trust and 5 years of financial support and her own name, written 4 times, on legal documents, by a man who had made his decision the way he made everything, slowly, completely, without taking it back. She thought about what that man had seen in her that she could not entirely see in herself. She thought about Daniel walking the fence line. She thought about Becca's voice saying, "You cannot say no to this." She thought about Jean, the way she always came back to Jean when things were too large to process alone. She thought about what he would have said, sitting across this table. She thought he would have said something practical first, something about what it meant for the finances, what the taxes would look like, whether they could actually run a cattle operation, because Jean was always practical first. And then, after the practical things, he would have said something that cut right to it. He always did. She thought he would have said, "Martha, someone sees you, let them." She sat with that for a long time. Outside the window, the afternoon had gone on without her noticing. The light had shifted from the flat brightness of midday to the softer lower light of middle afternoon. A bird was working in the oak tree. A car went by on the street. She picked up her phone. She called Elias. He answered on the second ring. "I read it," she said. "All of it?" he said. "All of it, twice." A pause. Then, "And?" she said. "I need to come talk to you." "I figured," he said. "Come Sunday." She said she would. She spent the rest of that afternoon in a state that was not quite distraction, but was not quite focus either. She thought and could not stop thinking. She told Daniel that evening, sitting across from him at the dinner table, and watched his face go through a series of expressions that she had never seen from him in that particular sequence. Surprise, confusion, something that looked like it might be wonder, and then a long stillness that she recognized as the stillness he got when something had landed too big to immediately speak. He said, finally, "He's giving you the whole thing." "Yes," she said. "The land, and the house, and the cattle, and everything." "Yes." Daniel looked at his plate. He looked at the window. He looked at her. He said, "When I was out there, walking that fence line, I thought, this is what it would feel like to have something to take care of. I said that to you. You remember?" "I remember," Martha said. "I meant it," he said quietly. "I didn't know what I meant by it. But I meant it." She nodded. He said, "What are you going to do?" She told him she was going to see Elias on Sunday, and that after that she would know better. He accepted this without pressing. That was another thing she appreciated about Daniel. He did not press. He trusted her to arrive at things in her own time. Sunday came. She drove east. The ranch was changed by the season, the grass paler and shorter, the cottonwoods along the creek mostly bare now, the sky higher and clearer than it had been in the heat of summer, the gate, the lane, the house on the rise. She had driven this route enough times now that it felt familiar in the way that matters, not just recognizable but known, the way a place knows you back. Elias was on the porch when she pulled up. He was sitting in the wooden chair he kept there, the one with the worn armrests, and he had a cup of coffee and the look of a man who has been expecting company and is ready for whatever comes with it. She got out of the car and walked up to the porch and sat down in the other chair, the one she had claimed over the months by sitting in it, and they looked out at the yard together for a moment before either of them said anything. Then Martha said, "Elias, this is too much." "I know you'd say that," he said. "It's too much," she said again. "You've known me 2 months, a little over 2 months." "I know how long," he said. "Your family built this land," she said. 4 generations. I have no connection to it. I have no experience running anything like this. I wouldn't know what I was doing. I'm a waitress who makes soup and visits on Sundays." Elias turned and looked at her. He had that direct, unhurried quality that she had come to know well, and he used it now, the full attention of it, the weight of a man who does not look away from things. He said, "Tell me something." She waited. "Why do you come out here on Sundays?" She thought about this. She said, "Because I want to." "Why?" he said. She thought some more. She said, "Because I like being here. Because I like talking with you. Because—" She stopped. She started again. "Because something about this place feels important. It feels like it matters. And being near things that matter feels good." Elias nodded. He picked up his coffee. He said, "That's why." She looked at him. He said, "You don't have to know how to run cattle. Your son is 27 years old, and he walked this property for 3 hours and came away different. You can see that, can't you?" She could. She did not say so, but she could. He said, "I'm not doing this because I feel I owe you something. I'm not doing this because of the road, though what you did that evening is not something I forget. I'm doing this because I've watched you. I have spent 6 weeks watching you, Martha, and you are the only person I have encountered in the years since June passed who looked at this place and heard it the way it deserves to be heard." She looked out at the yard, at the bare cottonwood at the fence line, at the sky. She felt the thing again, the two large feelings she had felt on her kitchen floor, and she pressed it back enough to keep her voice level. She said, "What if I can't do it justice?" He said, "I'm not asking you to do it justice right away. I'm asking you to love it. The rest can be learned." She was quiet for a very long time. Then she reached out and put her hand over his on the armrest of his chair. Just for a moment, a brief, steady pressure. And she said, "All right. Tell me what I need to know." And Elias, who had been waiting for this, straightened in his chair, set down his coffee, and began to talk. What happened next was not a single moment, but a season. Autumn moved into winter, and with it came the beginning of something that Martha could not have named at the start, but that she would describe later, when she had the language for it, as learning to belong somewhere. It was not a fast process. It was not a glamorous one. It was the process of a person who has been rooted in one set of circumstances for many years, slowly, carefully, deliberately putting roots into new ground, and it required the patience of someone who understands that roots do not grow on schedule. She went to the ranch on Sundays. Then she began going on Saturdays too. Then sometimes a weekday when her schedule allowed. She was not yet living there. The house was still Elias's house, and she would not have considered otherwise, but she was learning it. She was learning the shape of the days on a working ranch, the rhythm of early mornings, and the things that needed doing, and the sequence in which they needed doing. Pete and Calvin received her with the particular wariness of men who have worked for someone they respect, and are not entirely sure what to make of the new person their employer has introduced into the situation. Pete was 63, and had the build and face of a man who has spent 40 years outdoors, deep-lined, deeply tanned, with hands that looked like they had been carved from something. Calvin was 48, quieter, with a careful precision in the way he worked, that Martha found she admired from the first time she watched him. She did not try to ingratiate herself. She was not that kind of person, and she suspected they were not that kind of people either. She simply came and watched and asked questions when she had them, and she kept her questions practical and specific, and she helped when there was something she could do without getting in the way, and she stayed out of the way when there wasn't. The first time Calvin let her help with something without being asked, without looking at Pete first, without any of the checking that had been happening, she took it as a sign that something had shifted. She did not remark on it. She just helped. Daniel started coming too. This was partly her idea and partly his. She had suggested, casually, that he might want to spend more time out at the ranch while they were learning the place. And he had agreed with a readiness that told her he had already been thinking the same thing. He cut his warehouse shifts to 3 days a week, which he could afford to do, because his expenses were low, and because he had been putting a little away. The first morning he arrived at the ranch at 6 in the morning, before Pete and Calvin, and worked the whole day without stopping except to eat. Martha watched Elias watching Daniel, and saw something in the old man's face that she did not have a word for, but that moved her. He looked satisfied, not in a small way, in a deep, complete way, the way a person looks when something they were worried about has turned out to be all right. Becca came one weekend in November. She drove the 4 hours from her apartment and spent 2 days at the ranch, sleeping in the spare room in Elias's house, which he offered without ceremony, and she accepted without fuss. And she spent those days with her camera, which she always had with her, documenting the place the way she did everything she cared about, carefully, patiently, looking for the angle that told the truth. She photographed the pastures in the flat winter light. She photographed the equipment shed and the old windmill and the creek with its bare cottonwoods. She photographed Pete's hands repairing a section of fence. She photographed Elias in his chair on the porch with his coffee. She photographed Daniel standing at the far edge of the east pasture, looking out at the land the way he had looked at it the first time, which was the same way he always looked at it. On the second evening, Elias asked if he could see some of the photographs. Becca showed him on her camera, turning the small screen toward him. He looked at each one slowly. When he got to the photograph of the porch, his chair, his coffee, the yard stretching out beyond the porch rail, he looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "That's the place." Becca said, "That's exactly the place." He looked at her. Then he said, "You have your mother's eye for things." Becca, who did not cry easily, looked down at the camera. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Elias." He nodded and handed the camera back, and they sat in comfortable silence, the way people sit who have just exchanged something real and do not need to elaborate on it. Martha watched all of this from the kitchen doorway, where she was standing with a dish towel in her hand, and she felt the specific, piercing sweetness of a moment you know you will not forget. In December, Elias had a health check with his doctor, a routine thing, a follow-up from the summer. Martha drove him because he asked her to, which was the first time he had asked her to take him anywhere, and which she noted without making anything of it. The doctor told him his heart was in reasonable condition for a man his age, that the episode in August had been a warning he would do well to heed, that he should continue to limit his time in direct heat, and make sure he was eating properly, and not pushing himself beyond what his body was currently able to do. Elias listened to all of this with the attentiveness of a man who respects information, even when it is not what he might have preferred to hear. On the way back to the ranch, he was quiet for the first half of the drive. Then he said, "He didn't tell me anything I didn't already know." "No," Martha said, "but it's useful to hear it from someone else." Elias was quiet again for a while. Then he said, "I've got some good time left. I think. I'm not done." "No," Martha said, "you're not." He looked at her sideways, a brief, dry look, the kind that meant he had noticed what she had said and appreciated it. She kept her eyes on the road and felt the warmth of it. Christmas came. Martha had never spent Christmas away from her children, and she did not this year either. She spent Christmas Eve and Christmas Day at home with Daniel, and Becca drove down, and they had the meal they always had, and she told them both that she was glad they were there, which was always true, and felt more true this year than most, because she was aware, in a way she had not always been, of what it meant to have people in a house. She brought Elias a plate of food on the day after Christmas, the leftovers that were always, she thought, better than the meal itself. She brought it to the ranch and found him in the kitchen with Pete, who had come in from the small house and was drinking coffee at the table. The three of them sat together for an hour. It was easy in the way of people who have found their footing with each other, and Martha drove home that afternoon with a feeling she recognized, eventually, as belonging, not just to the people, but to the pattern of the days. The Sunday visits and the Wednesday stops, and the early mornings, when she sometimes arrived before the light was fully up. The rhythm of it, the shape it had given to the weeks. January came. The land was dormant and cold and beautiful, in the particular way of winter on the Texas plains. The grass pale gold, and the sky enormous and blue, and without apology. The cattle moved differently in the cold, more slowly, clustering in certain parts of the pasture that Pete explained to Daniel had better wind protection, and Daniel filed this information carefully and asked follow-up questions that showed he was building a real understanding and not just accumulating facts. Elias began spending more time with Daniel specifically, not teaching exactly. Elias was not a man who taught in the formal sense, but talking, the way he talked, slowly and specifically, about the land, about this field and what it needed, about this fence line and the history of why it ran where it ran, about the water situation in a dry year and what they had done in the drought of 1988 and what had worked. He told Daniel things he had learned from his own father and things he had figured out himself, and Daniel absorbed all of it in the way that people absorb things they are actually meant to know. Martha watched this and felt something that was not quite like anything else she had felt in the course of this whole extraordinary season. It was the feeling of watching a future take shape. Not hers. She was already made, already herself, already the woman she had become through decades of living. But Daniel's. She was watching Daniel find the thing that he was for, watching the restlessness that had followed him since his early 20s begin to settle, watching a young man who had been directionless find a direction that was worthy of him. It was one of the best things she had ever seen. She called Becca one evening, from the driveway of the ranch, sitting in the car before she drove home, and told her. Becca was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, do you realize what's happening?" Martha said, "Tell me what you see." Becca said, "I see a family finding its place. That's what I see." Martha looked at the house on the rise, the lit window in the front, the pale winter sky behind it. She said, "Yes, that's what it is." She drove home in the dark, and the road was the same road it had always been, but she was not the same person who had driven it in August, and she knew that, and she was glad. The days of early spring arrived, in the way that spring always arrives on that particular piece of land, not with a sudden announcement, but with a slow accumulation of evidence, a warmer angle to the morning light, grass beginning to show the first thin green beneath the pale gold of winter, the cattle moving with more energy, ranging further into the pastures, which Pete said was a reliable sign, the mockingbirds returning to the oak trees and making their full noise, which was a lot of noise, because mockingbirds do not do things quietly. Daniel was out at the ranch 3 days a week now, sometimes 4. He had left the warehouse job entirely in February, which he had told Martha not with drama but plainly, the way he told most things, as a fact he had decided and acted on. She had not argued. She had watched him for 6 months by then, and she knew, the way mothers know things that have been building over a long time, that he was right, that this was where he was supposed to be. He had taken on the care of the north pasture as his particular responsibility, with Pete's guidance. This meant checking the fence line every week, monitoring the grass and the soil, watching the cattle in that section, the way you watch something that is in your care, attentively, without it requiring effort, because the attention comes naturally. He had a notebook, a plain composition notebook, the kind from the hardware store, in which he wrote things down, observations, questions, things Pete had told him that he wanted to remember. It was not a careful, pretty notebook. It was a working notebook, written in the fast, slightly illegible hand of someone whose thoughts arrive faster than his pen. Elias found this notebook once on the kitchen table. Daniel had left it behind after a long day, and opened it. He read a few pages. He set it back where he found it, and when Daniel came to get it the next morning, Elias did not say anything about it. But that evening, at the table, he said to Martha, "Your boy is going to be good at this." Martha said, "I know." Elias said, "I mean very good. Not just capable. Good. It's a different thing." She said, "Yes, I know." He looked at her with a slight sideways expression that was his version of a smile. "You always know," he said. "I'm his mother," she said. "I've had 27 years to pay attention." He acknowledged this with a small nod, and poured himself more coffee, and they sat in the morning quiet of his kitchen, and listened to the mockingbirds doing what mockingbirds do, and it was one of the mornings that Martha later thought of, when she thought about that spring. One of the ordinary mornings that were extraordinary, precisely because of their ordinariness. Becca came back in March. She had been working on something, she said, though she was characteristically vague about what. She often did not talk about work until it was finished, preferring to keep a thing to herself until she understood what it was. She spent 4 days at the ranch this time, longer than her November visit, and she went everywhere, with her camera, and her notebooks, and her quiet observing eye. She photographed Calvin working the morning feeding, his breath visible in the cold air. She photographed the north pasture at sunrise, the light coming low and flat and gold across the grass. She photographed the equipment shed from inside, looking out through the open door at the yard. She photographed the photographs on the walls of Elias's house. Not invasively, she asked him first, and he told her to photograph whatever she liked. And she spent an afternoon with them, these layers of history going back to the 1890s, the stiff formal portraits, and the casual working photographs, and the ones that held the record of a family on a piece of land over 130 years. On the last evening of her visit, she showed Elias what she had been doing. Not just the photographs from this visit, but everything she had accumulated since November. Hundreds of images, which she had organized and edited, and begun to sequence into what was clearly becoming something larger than a personal record. Elias sat with her laptop for a long time. He went slowly through the images, the same way he did everything, deliberately, without hurry, giving each photograph the time it needed. When he finished, he set the laptop on the table and sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "This is the ranch." Becca said, "It is. All of it. The whole history of it. I want to turn it into a book, a real book, with the photographs and the written history. I've been researching the family records and the county archives. There's so much here, Elias. It should be documented. It should exist as a permanent thing." Elias looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "June would have loved you." Becca looked down. She pressed her lips together, the way she did when she was holding something in. Then she said, steadily, "I'd like to think I would have loved her too." He said, "I know you would have." He gave Becca full access to everything, the documents and the old photographs and the records and the letters and the boxes that had been in the attic since his mother's time and that he had never been able to bring himself to go through. He gave her all of it and asked only that she tell it truly, without making it more or less than it was. Becca said she would not dream of doing otherwise. She drove home with 3 boxes in the back of her car and a project that would occupy her for the next 18 months, and that quiet satisfaction of a person who has found the work that is equal to them. Daniel noticed things that spring that he had not been able to notice before, because now he had the winter's knowledge behind him and could see the seasonal change for what it was. He noticed the way the grass came back in different parts of the pasture at different rates, and he asked Pete about the soil differences that accounted for it, and Pete told him things that went back decades, that his own knowledge had been built on slowly over 20 years of observation. Daniel listened, and then went and looked at the places Pete had described, crouching at the fence, digging his hand into the soil the way he had watched Pete do it, feeling the texture and moisture of the ground with his fingers. Pete watched this and did not say anything about it, but Martha noticed him watching, and she noticed the particular quality of his watching, which was not supervisory. It was something closer to respect. In April, a group of distant relatives appeared. 3 of them, cousins of some degree, driving in from out of state in a rental car and arriving at Howard Briggs's office on a Monday morning. They had learned, somehow, about the estate restructuring. Martha never knew exactly how, and they were not pleased. Howard called Martha that afternoon to let her know, calmly and professionally, that this was a development they had anticipated and that the documentation was thorough and would hold up to scrutiny. Martha went home and sat at the kitchen table and felt something that she recognized, after a moment, as calm. Not forced calm, not the kind you have to manufacture, just the plain, clear state of a person who knows that what they are doing is right and has the ground of that knowledge under them. She called Elias. She told him. He said, "Howard'll handle it." She said, "I know. I just wanted you to hear it from me." He said, "I already knew. Howard called me first." She said, "Of course he did." There was a pause. Then Elias said, in a different tone, softer, more careful, "It's not going to be easy, you know. What comes next? It's not going to be simple." "I know," she said. "There will be people who have opinions about all of this," he said. "People who won't understand it, or won't like it, or will think they know better." "I know," she said again. "And you'll have hard years," he said. "Running land is not a thing that goes smoothly. There are years when the rain doesn't come, and years when it comes too much, and years when the cattle market does things that don't make any sense, and years when equipment breaks at the worst possible time." She said, "Elias." He stopped. She said, "I've had hard years. I know what to do with hard years." There was a pause. Then he said quietly, "Yes, I suppose you do." She told him she would see him Sunday, and hung up and sat with the phone in her hand, looking out the window at the street, which was the same street it had always been, but which she looked at differently now, from the position of a person who was standing somewhere new and could see the familiar things from a new angle. Spring moved through the weeks with its ordinary business, the grass growing, the cattle calving in the east pasture, Daniel learning the particular complexity of calving season from Pete and Calvin, learning how to identify the ones that needed help and the ones that did not, learning to be present without interfering, which is one of the more difficult skills in the care of living things. Martha watched her son in those weeks with a feeling she could not reduce to a simple word. Pride was part of it. So was grief, the quiet kind, the grief of a woman who sees in her son qualities that she also saw in his father, and who loves those qualities and misses the man who gave them, both at the same time. So was gratitude. So was something she had no name for, something that was specific to this season of her life, the particular aliveness of a time when everything is in motion and you can feel it moving. She still went to the diner. She had not left her job. She worked 3 days a week now instead of 5, which she had negotiated carefully, and her manager had agreed because she was valued and because she had been there 11 years, and because she was honest about the changes in her life without dramatizing them. She still knew every regular by name. She still refilled the coffees before they were asked for. She had simply reduced her hours because her life had expanded and the hours needed to go somewhere. One Tuesday morning in April, she was serving the men at the counter, the ones who came every morning and talked about weather and cattle prices, and one of them, an older man named Bud who had farmed east of town his whole life, asked her how her friend out on Route 12 was doing. She looked at him. He clarified. Drummond. Elias Drummond. We were in the same 4-H decades ago. Good man. I heard he had some health trouble last summer. Martha said. He's doing well. Better than the summer. Bud nodded and stirred his coffee. He said, good man, good rancher. That land is something. 4 generations of Drummonds on that ground. Hard to think about what happens to it when he's gone. Martha refilled his coffee and said, it'll be taken care of. Bud looked at her. He had the measured, perceptive look of a man who has spent his whole life reading weather and people, both of which require the same skill. He said, is that right? She said, that's right. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he went back to his coffee and his conversation, and Martha went back to her tables, and she felt, walking away, something like a smile on the inside that did not necessarily show on the outside, the private satisfaction of knowing something true that you are not yet saying, because the saying will come later, and the knowing is enough for now. The night Elias passed, there was no drama. That was the first thing Martha would say when people asked her, later, and she would say it not to minimize it, but because it was the truth, and because the truth of it was important. He had not gone in pain. He had not gone afraid. He had gone the way he had lived, quietly, in his own time, in the house where he had been born. He had been slowing for a few weeks. Not sharply, not alarmingly, but in the way that people who have lived long and paid attention can sometimes sense is the beginning of the final slope. He was more tired in the evenings. He sat longer on the porch in the mornings, not because he was resting from anything, but because the porch and the morning seemed enough. He ate less, though he ate well enough, and he talked about things that people sometimes talk about when they are coming to the end of their time, not in a morbid way, but in the way of someone doing a kind of accounting, reviewing what has mattered, and acknowledging it. He talked about June a great deal in those last weeks. Not painfully, not as someone dwelling in loss, but as someone for whom the distance was closing, and the reunion was becoming real, in a way that made the past feel current. He talked about her laugh, which he said was the loudest thing in any room, and that she had never tried to make it smaller. He talked about the way she had walked across the yard in the mornings, in the first years, when they were young, and the land was new to both of them, and everything was possible. He talked about the land. He said, once, near the end, sitting on the porch in the thin evening light of early May, that he thought he had done right by it. Not perfectly, because nothing in farming is perfect, but honestly, and with the full measure of himself, and that he thought his father and grandfather would have been able to say the same. He said this quietly, to the yard, not exactly to Martha, but she was there, and she heard it, and she said, you have. You really have. He looked at her. He said, you'll do right by it too. She said, I intend to. He said, I know. He asked her, in the second week of May, if she would come and stay for a few days. He did not say why exactly, but she understood, and she arranged her hours at the diner and told Daniel, and she came. She slept in the spare room, the one where Becca had slept, and she was there in the mornings when he woke and in the evenings when he was tired. Daniel came every day. Pete and Calvin came into the house more than they usually did, which was their own way of being present. On a Thursday night in the third week of May, Martha was sitting in the chair beside his bed. They had moved a chair in, because that was practical, and Elias was breathing slowly, and she was holding his hand, which she had not done before. His hand was large and warm, and very still. He said her name once, clearly, about an hour before the end. She said, "I'm here." He was quiet. Then he said, "Good." And that was the last thing. The hospice nurse, who had been coming for the past week, arrived just after. She was a kind, practical woman, who had done this many times, and who handled the necessary things with the efficiency that comes from genuine care rather than indifference. She looked at Martha and said, "He was at peace." It was not a platitude. She said it the way you say something you believe. Martha sat for a while longer, alone with him, in the quiet of the house that had been his whole life. She looked at the room, the plain furniture, the small window, the hat hanging on the hook by the door, the pair of boots on the floor. She looked at his hands, which were still on the blanket. She said, very quietly, "Thank you, Elias, for everything, all of it." She drove home in the early morning. Daniel was up. He had been sitting at the kitchen table, not asleep, and when she came in he looked at her, and she looked at him, and they sat together in the kitchen, without speaking for a long time, the way people who love each other and are in grief together do not always need to speak. Then Daniel said, "We'll take care of it." She knew he meant the land. "Yes," she said, "we will." The funeral was a small thing, as Elias had wanted. He had told Howard what he wanted, which was practical and simple, and Howard had told the appropriate people, and it was done that way. The county knew Elias Drummond, and some of those who had known him through the years came. People from the farm community, people from town, people whose faces Martha recognized from the diner, where they had told her about weather and cattle prices for 11 years. Pete and Calvin were there. Becca drove down and stood beside her mother, her camera for once left in the car. The distant relatives arrived, 2 of them, not 3 this time. They had spoken with Howard, and the legal situation had been made clear to them, and they attended the funeral with the constrained manner of people who have accepted a situation they disliked. Martha spoke with them briefly. She was not hostile. She was not apologetic. She was simply herself, direct and warm, and not inclined to pretend a complexity she did not feel about what was right. One of them, a woman named Patricia, who was some kind of second cousin, said to her, "He must have thought very highly of you." Martha said, "I hope I deserved it." Patricia looked at her for a moment. Then she said, with what seemed like genuine consideration, "I think he knew what he was doing." Martha said, "He always did." The legal challenges that Howard had anticipated came in June. 2 of them, both filed by the relatives, both attempting to argue that the estate restructuring had been made under circumstances that compromised Elias's judgment. Howard handled them without apparent difficulty. He had the documentation, the timeline, the medical records showing that Elias's cognitive capacity had been fully intact, the months of clearly deliberate and consistent planning, the thoroughness of the preparation. He had witnesses. He had the record. Both challenges were dismissed within 60 days. Martha received the news from Howard on a Monday morning with the same calm she had felt months earlier. She thanked Howard, who said he would send the final documentation by mail. She hung up and called Daniel, who was already at the ranch. He answered quickly, the way he answered now, the particular readiness of someone who is somewhere they belong and is present in it. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, so it's done." "It's done," she said. "Then we just do the work," he said. She laughed. A clear, full laugh. The kind she had not heard from herself in a long time, or had not noticed when she did. "Yes," she said, "then we just do the work." The ownership transferred formally, on a Wednesday in July. Martha stood in Howard's office above the hardware store, on the second floor with the enthusiastic staircase, and signed the documents that made the Drummond Ranch legally hers. She wore the same clothes she wore to church on Sundays. Her best blouse, clean slacks, her shoes that were not her work shoes. She had come alone. This felt like the right choice. It was a quiet thing, and it deserved to be done quietly. Howard witnessed her signature, and notarized it, and handed her the file, and said, "Congratulations, Martha." Not with fanfare. With the warmth of a man who had watched this whole story from the sideline, and found it, in the end, exactly right. She thanked him and went down the stairs and stood on the sidewalk in the July heat, the same kind of heat that had been on the road that August evening, the same heavy, honest, unmistakable Texas heat, and held the file in her hands and took a long breath. Then she got in her car and drove east. 2 years passed the way good years pass, when you are doing work that matters. Not slowly, not quickly, but fully. The days were used. The seasons came in their order, and the ranch moved with them, and the people on the ranch moved with it, and things were built and fixed and learned and failed and tried again and sometimes failed again and sometimes worked, and all of it was part of the same ongoing effort of caring for a living thing. Daniel ran the cattle operation. This had not been an instant transformation, he was the first to say that, but a gradual one, built on the foundation of everything that Elias and Pete had taught him through that first winter and spring, and on his own growing experience, and on the particular quality he had always had of being able to figure out what a situation needed and providing it without making a spectacle of the process. Pete worked alongside him still, as he had agreed to, and the two of them had developed the easy working relationship of people who understand each other without needing to explain themselves too often. Calvin was still there too, steady and precise, the kind of person who is the spine of any working operation. Daniel had hired 2 young men from the area, brothers named Owen and Kyle, who had grown up nearby and whose family had been farming cotton on hard ground that was no longer doing what it needed to do. Daniel had met Owen at the hardware store and had a conversation with him that was, on the surface, about fence materials, but that was, underneath, about a young man who needed work and who had the quality, that same quality Daniel himself had had, that his mother recognized and Elias had recognized, of someone looking for the right thing to do his energy in. He had hired Owen the next week and Kyle the week after that. Owen and Kyle worked like people who had been given something they intended to be worthy of. They did not need to be told things twice. They were early in the mornings and patient in the evenings, and curious in the way that young people are when they are learning something real. Daniel taught them with the same plainness that had been used to teach him, without ceremony, by being willing to explain, and then by trusting them to do. Martha still worked at the diner on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She had reduced it to those 2 days a month after the ownership transferred, because she had more than enough to manage with the ranch, but she had not stopped. When people asked her why she still went in, she told them she liked it. She liked seeing people. She liked the mornings at the counter, and the regulars, and the particular rhythm of a busy diner, the way everything moves at once, but nothing gets lost. She was not going to stop doing something she liked just because she no longer needed to do it for financial reasons. That seemed to her like a very poor approach to life. Bud, at the counter, asked her about the ranch on most of the Tuesdays she came in. He asked about the cattle prices, and the grass, and the season, and the calving, the questions of a farmer who is genuinely curious about another piece of land. She answered all of them in the same plain terms she had learned from Elias, not performing knowledge she did not have, not hedging the things she did know. He listened and nodded, and sometimes offered something from his own experience, and sometimes she took that something home and told Daniel, and Daniel noted it in his notebook. The notebook was now in its 2nd volume. Becca's book was published in the fall of the 2nd year. It was called 4 Generations, which was as simple and accurate a title as you could put on 130 years of one family's relationship to one piece of ground. It had Becca's photographs and the written history she had researched through 2 years of county archives and personal documents and conversations with Pete and Calvin, and with older members of the community who remembered the Drummonds from decades back. It was published by a small press in Austin, the kind that publishes books that do not have enormous commercial ambitions, but that will be read by the people who need them. It sold modestly in most places. In Haskell County it was a different matter. The feed stores stocked it. The hardware store stocked it. The library ordered 6 copies and had a waiting list. At the diner, a copy appeared on the counter near the register, and several of the regulars bought their own. Bud held his copy one Tuesday morning and turned to a page of photographs. Pete's hands on a fence post, Calvin in the equipment shed, Daniel at the north pasture in the winter light, and looked at them for a long time. Then he said, to no one in particular but in Martha's direction, she did right by it. Martha said, she always does. Howard Briggs came out to the ranch one afternoon in October, the 2nd October, on a personal visit rather than a professional one. He came in the late afternoon when the light was at its best, and sat on the porch with Martha, and accepted a cup of coffee, and looked out at the yard. The cottonwood at the fence line was gold. The cattle were visible in the east pasture. The sky was enormous, and clear and blue, in a way that it only gets in October in Texas. He said, "Elias would have liked this." Martha said, "I think about that. I hope it's true." He said, "It is. I knew him 20 years, and this is exactly what he wanted." Exactly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I never understood, completely, why he chose us. I've thought about it a great deal. I still don't think I entirely understand it." Howard said, "I do." He sipped his coffee. He said, "He told me, when we were drafting the documents." He said, she stopped. On a hot road, after a long day, when she had every reason to keep driving, she stopped. He said, "That's not a small thing. That's what a person is." Martha looked at the yard, at the cottonwood, at the cattle in the east pasture. She thought about that August evening, the shimmering road, the green truck in the ditch, the decision she had made without entirely knowing she was making it. How small it had felt at the time. How ordinary. She said, "It didn't feel like anything special." Howard said, "That's exactly why it was." The farmhouse had been changed in small ways, and not changed in most ways. Martha had not renovated or redecorated. The furniture was Elias's furniture. The photographs were Elias's photographs. The kitchen window still faced south, and the porch still had the 2 wooden chairs with the worn armrests. She had added a few things: a hook by the back door that had not been there before, a rug in the hallway that she had made herself over a winter's worth of evenings, some of her own things placed alongside the existing things, in a way that said both of us, rather than instead. On the wall of the living room, above the fireplace, Elias's photograph of June still hung exactly where it had always hung. June standing in the front pasture, laughing at something off camera, her hair loose around her shoulders. Beside it, Becca had added a photograph from her own collection, taken on a Sunday afternoon, unposed, caught in the moment. Martha standing in the same pasture, the same afternoon light, laughing at something Daniel had said. Her hair was loose, which it almost never was at work, only on Sundays, when she was not worrying about anything practical. The 2 photographs were the same photograph, in the way that all true things resemble each other, not because they were identical, but because they were honest. 2 women, in the same field, in the same light, in love with the same place. Pete had stopped in the doorway once, and looked at them. He had not said anything for a long moment. Then he said, "That's right." He had turned and walked back to the kitchen, to get his hat and his coffee, and the remark had stood in the room, with the same completeness as Elias's morning observations, brief, certain, needing nothing added to it. Owen came to Martha one morning in the second spring. He came carefully, the way someone comes when they have been working up to something for a while, and want to say it right. He said that he had a younger sister, 18, who had just finished school, and was trying to figure out what to do next. He said she was good with her hands, and not afraid of work, and interested in animals. He said he was not sure if there was any room or need, but he thought he ought to mention it. Martha said, "Tell her to come out Saturday morning." The girl's name was Lucy. She was steady and quiet, and quick to understand what she was being shown, with a particular gentleness around the cattle that Pete said he did not always see in people who had not grown up with animals. She started part-time. Within 3 months she was full-time, and within a year she was indispensable, which is the trajectory of people who are in the right place. Martha watched Lucy learn the way she had watched Daniel learn, with the same particular feeling, the pleasure of seeing someone find the work that fits them. It never got old. She thought it probably never would. In the evenings, she sat on the porch. She sat in the same chair she had always sat in, the one she had claimed that first autumn, and she looked at the yard, and the cottonwood, and the land spreading away in every direction, and the sky coming down enormous and blue, or pink, or dark, and full of stars, depending on the hour. She was not rich, in the way that word is usually meant. The ranch made what it made, which varied with the seasons and the markets, and it cost what it cost, which was a considerable amount, and the operating trust that Elias had established gave them a cushion for the hard years that she had not stopped being grateful for. She was not poor the way she had been poor before, the careful, quiet, invisible poverty of the cracked windshield, and the tight choice between one necessity and another. She was somewhere in the middle, which is where most working people who are doing something real with their lives tend to be. She was, she thought, on a Thursday evening in the 2nd October, sitting on the porch with the last of her coffee, and the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and the sound of the cattle settling in the east pasture, and the light on, in the equipment shed, where Daniel and Owen were fixing something that had needed fixing. She was, she thought, exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not think of this in grand terms. She was not a person given to grand statements about her own life. She thought of it the way she thought of most things, plainly, directly, without decoration. She was here. This was right. She had earned it not by anything dramatic, not by being exceptional, not by having something others did not, but by being, consistently, the kind of person who stopped, who knocked on the window, who sat with someone in the heat, who brought gas station flowers and homemade soup, who came back on Sunday, who said yes when yes was the right answer, even when it was frightening, even when she was not sure, even when it was more than she had ever imagined belonging to. She set her coffee cup down on the porch rail. She looked at the stars. They were extraordinary, the way they always were out here, away from the lights of town, dense and clear and very old. She thought about Gene. She thought about how he would have sat beside her in this chair and looked at the same stars and said something practical, and then something that cut right to the heart of it, the way he always did. She thought she knew what he would have said. He would have said, "You did good, Martha." And she thought she would have said back, "We did good. All of us." And then she thought, because she was a practical woman, always had been, that there was probably still some of the soup left from dinner, and that she should bring a bowl out to Daniel and Owen before they called it a night, because men who work with their hands in the evening need to eat something before they sleep. She picked up her cup. She got up from the chair. She went inside. The door slapped shut behind her, the way screen doors do. That particular sound, quick and complete, like a sentence that has found its ending. And the stars went on, and the cattle settled, and the land held everything that had been given to it, and everything that had been built on it, and everything that would grow from it yet.